Hello everyone and welcome to my channel M4 Short. This is M and tonight I'm going to read to you to sleep. So the book I'm going to read to you is Agatha Raisin and the Terrible Tourist by MC Beaton. This is book number 6 from a 32 or 35 book saga. And I must say that I've been addicted to it ever since I discovered this author. I have already read 12 books so far, if I'm not wrong. So I do have to prevent you that English is not my first language, so there might be a few bumps in the road every now and then. Nevertheless, I will try and do my best. So without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 1. Agatha Raisin was a bewildered and unhappy woman. Her marriage to the next-door neighbor James Lacey had been stopped by the appearance of a husband she had assumed hopefully to be dead. But he was very much alive, that was, until he was murdered. Solving the murder had, thought Agatha, brought herself and James close again. But he had departed for North Cyprus, leaving her alone. Although life in the Cotswold village of Carsley had softened Agatha around the edges, she was still in part the hard-bitten businesswoman she had been when she had run her own public relations firm in Mayfair before selling up, taking early retirement and moving to the country. And so she had decided to pursue James. Cyprus, she knew, was partitioned into two parts, with Turkish Cypriots in the north and Greek Cypriots in the south. James had gone to the north, and somewhere, somehow, she would find him and make him love her again. North Cyprus was where they had been supposed to go on their honeymoon, and in her less tender moments, Agatha thought it rather hard-hearted and crass of James Lacey to have gone there on his own. When Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife, called, it was to find Agatha amidst piles of brightly coloured summer clothes. "Are you taking all those with you?" asked Mrs. Bloxby, pushing a strand of grey hair out of her eyes. "I don't know how long I'll be there," said Agatha. "I'd better take lots." Mrs. Bloxby looked at her doubtfully. Then she said, "Do you think you're doing the right thing? I mean, men do not like to be pursued." "How else do you get one?" demanded Agatha angrily. She picked up a swimsuit, one piece, gold and black, and looked at it critically. "I have doubts about James Lacey," said Mrs. Bloxby in her gentle voice. "He always struck me as being a cold, rather self-contained man." "You don't know him," said Agatha defensively, thinking of nights in bed with James, tumultuous nights, but silent nights during which he had not said one word of love. "Anyway, I need a holiday." "Don't be away too long. You'll miss us all." "There's not much to miss about Carsley. The ladies' society, the church fêtes, yawn." "That's a bit cruel, Agatha. I thought you enjoyed them." But Agatha felt that a Carsley without James had suddenly become a bleak and empty place, filled from end to end with nervous boredom. "Where are you flying from?" "Stansted Airport, in Essex." "How will you get there?" "I'll drive and leave the car in the long-stay car park." "But if you're going to be away for a very long, that will cost you a fortune. Let me drive you." But Agatha shook her head. She wanted to leave Carsley, sleepy Carsley with its gentle villages and thatched roof cottages, behind and everything to do with it. The doorbell rang. Agatha opened the door, and Detective Sergeant Bill Wong walked in and looked around. "So you're really going?" he remarked. "Yes, and don't you try to stop me either, Bill." I don't think Lacey's worth all that effort, Agatha. It's my life. Bill smiled. He was half Chinese and half English, in his mid-20s, and Agatha's first friend, for before she moved to the Cotswolds, she had lived in a hard-bitten and friendless world. Go if you must. Can you bring me back a box of Turkish delight for my mother? Sure, said Agatha. She says you must come over for dinner when you get back. Agatha repressed a shudder. Mrs. Wong was a dreadful woman and a lousy cook. She went into the kitchen to make coffee and cut cake, and soon they were all sitting around and gossiping about local matters. Agatha felt her resolve begin to weaken. She had a sudden, clear picture of James Lacey's face turning hard and cold when he saw her again, but thrust it out of her mind. She was going, and that was that. Stansted Airport was a delight to Agatha after her previous experience of the terrible crowds at Heathrow. She found she could not only smoke in the departure lounge, but at the gate itself. There were a few British tourists and expatriates. The expatriates were distinguishable from the tourists because they wore those sort of clothes that the breed always wear. The women in print frocks, the men in lightweight suits or blazers, the inevitable cravats, and all had those strangulated sons and daughters of the Raj voices. Colonial Britain seemed to be alive and well on Turkish Cypriot Airways. As she sat in the gate, she was surrounded mainly by Turkish voices. Her fellow passengers all seemed to have great piles of hung luggage. The flight departure was announced. Those in the smoking seats were called first. With a happy sigh, Agatha made her way onto the plane. She had burned her boats behind her. There was no turning back now. The plane soared above the grey, rainy skies and flat fields of Essex, and all the passengers applauded wildly. Why were they applauding, wondered Agatha. Do they know something I don't? Is it unusual for one of their planes to take off at all? The minute the plane wheels were up, the no smoking sign clicked off, and Agatha was soon surrounded by a fog of cigarette smoke. She had a window seat, and next to her was a large Turkish Cypriot woman who smiled at her from time to time. Agatha took out a book and began to read. Then, just as the plane was starting to descend to Izmir in western Turkey, where she knew they would have to wait for an hour before taking off again, the plane was hit by the most awful turbulence. The hostesses clung onto the trolleys, which lurched dangerously from side to side. Agatha began to pray under her breath. No one else seemed in the slightest phased. They fastened their seat belts and chattered amiably away in Turkish. The expats seemed used to it, and the few tourists like Agatha were frightened to let down the British side by showing fear. Just a moment, I'm going to sip a little bit of tea. Just when she thought the plane would shake itself apart, the lights of Izmir appeared below as soon as they landed. Again, everyone applauded, this time Agatha joining in. That was scary, said Agatha to the woman next to her. It was a bit of fun, love, said the Turkish Cypriot woman, speaking to English in the accent of London East End. I mean, you'd pay for something like that at Disney World. After an hour, the plane took off again. Between Turkey and Cyprus, they were served with a hard square of bread and a goat cheese, which looked as if it had been stamped out of a machine, washed down with sour cherry juice. Agatha felt the plane beginning to descend again. More turbulence, this time a thunderstorm. The plane lurched and bucked like a wild thing and looking out of the window, Agatha saw to her dismay that the whole plane appeared to be covered in sheets of blue lightning. Again, the passengers smiled and chatted and smoked. Agatha could not keep quiet any longer. "He shouldn't try to land in this weather," she said to the woman next to her. "Oh, they can land in anything, love. Pilots, Turkish, they're good." "Ladies and gentles," said a soothing voice, "we are shortly about to land at Ershan Airport." Again noisy applause on landing. Agatha peered out. It had been raining. She shuffled off the back of the plane onto the staircase, which had not been properly attached to the plane, and bobbed and dipped and swayed dangerously. "I'll swim home," thought Agatha. Having successfully reached the tarmac, she realized the heat was suffocating. It was like moving through warm soup. Warily, she walked into the airport buildings. It looked more like a military airport than a civilian one. It had actually been an RAF airfield up until 1975, and not much had been done to it since then. She waited in a long time at passport control, a great number of the Turkish Cypriots having British passports. Her friend of the airplane said behind her, "Ask them for a form. Don't let them stamp your passport." "Why?" asked Agatha, swinging around. "Because if you want to go to Greece, they won't let you in there if you've got one of our stamps on your passport. But they'll give you a form and stamp that, and then you can take it out of your passport, love, and throw it away afterwards." Agatha thanked her, got her form, filled it in, and went to wait for her luggage. And waited. "What the hell's going on here?" she demanded angrily. No one replied, although a few smiled at her cheerfully. They talked, they smoked, they hugged each other. Agatha Raisin, pushy and domineering, had landed amongst the most laid-back people in the world. By the time the luggage arrived and she had arranged her 2 large suitcases onto a trolley and got through customs, she was soaking with sweat and trembling with fatigue. She had booked into the Dome Hotel in Kyrenia and had told them by telephone before she left England to have a taxi waiting for her. At first, as she scanned the crowd of waiting faces at the airport, she thought no one was there to meet her. Then she saw a man holding up a card which said, "Mrs. Raisin." "Dome Hotel?" asked Agatha without much hope. "Sure," said the taxi driver, "no problem." Agatha wondered if there might be some Mrs. Raisin looking for a taxi, but she was too tired to care. She sank thankfully into the back seat. The black night swirled past her beyond the steamy windows. The taxi swung off a dual carriageway through some army chicanes and then began to climb up a precipitous mountain road. Jagged mountains stood up against the night sky. Then the driver said, "Kyrenia," and far below on her right, Agatha could see the twinkling lights of a town, and somewhere down there was James Lacey. This is green tea, in case you're wondering. Sorry for the slurping, by the way. Couldn't help it. Let me know if there are any tea enthusiasts awake at this point. So let's continue. The Dome Hotel is a large building on the waterfront of Kyrenia, Turkish name Girne, which has seen better days and has a certain battered colonial grandeur. There is something endearing about the dome. Agatha checked in and had her bags carried up to her room. She switched on the air conditioning, bathed, and got ready for bed, too tired to unpack her suitcases. She stretched out on the bed, but exhausted as she was, sleep would not come. She tossed and turned and then got out of bed again. She fumbled with the curtains, drew them back, opened the window and then the shutters. She walked out onto a small balcony, her anger draining away. The Mediterranean, silvered by moonlight, stretched out before her, calm and peaceful. The air smelt of jasmine and the salt tang of the sea. She leaned her hands on the iron railing at the edge of the balcony and took deep breaths of warm air. The waves of the sea crashed onto the rocks, and to her left was a seawater swimming pool carved out of the rock. When she returned to her room, she found she was beginning to scratch at painful bites on her neck and arms. Mosquitoes! She found a tube of insect bite cream in her luggage and applied it generously. Then she lay down on the bed again after having closed the windows and shutters. She dialed reception. "Efendim," said a wary voice on the phone. "There is a mosquito in my room," snapped Agatha. "Efendim?" "Oh, never mind," growled Agatha. Despite the buzzing of the mosquito and her fear of getting more bites, for if she did meet James and they went swimming, she did not want to be covered in unsightly lumps, her eyes began to close. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," she called. A hotel servant came in carrying a fly swat. His black eyes ranged brightly around the room. Then he swept hard with the fly swat. "Gone now," he said cheerfully. Agatha thanked him and tipped him. Her eyes closed again, and she plunged into a nightmare where she was trying to get to North Cyprus, but the plane had been diverted to Hong Kong. When she awoke in the morning, gladness flooded her. She was here in Cyprus, and somewhere out in that jasmine-scented world was James. She put on a smart flower cotton dress and sandals and went downstairs for breakfast. The dining room overlooked the sea. There were a number of Israeli tourists, which puzzled Agatha, who knew this to be a Muslim country and did not know that Turkish Muslims have a great admiration for Judaism. There were also mainland Turkish tourists. That too she found out later when she began to be able to tell the difference between Turk and Turkish Cypriot. But the British tourists were immediately recognizable by their clothes, their white, sheepish face, and that odd irresolute look of the British abroad. The air conditioning was working in the restaurant. Agatha helped herself from an odd buffet selection which included black olives and goat cheese, and then, anxious to begin the hunt, walked out of the hotel. She let out a whimper as the full force of the heat struck her. British to the core, Agatha just had to complain to someone. She marched back and up to the reception desk. "Is it always as hot as this?" she snarled. "I mean, it's September. Summer's over." "It's the hottest September for 50 years, said the receptionist. "I can't move in this heat." He gave an indifferent shrug. Agatha was to find that the receptionist was Turkish and that Turkish hotel servants have had a civility bypass. "Why don't you go for a sail?" he said. "You'll get one of the boats round at the harbour. Cooler on the water." "I don't want to waste time," said Agatha. "I'm looking for someone, a Mr. James Lacey. Is he staying here?" The receptionist checked the records. "No." "Then can you give me a list of hotels in North Cyprus?" "No." "Why not?" "We haven't got one." "Oh, for heaven's sake, can I hire a car?" "Next door to the hotel, Atlantic Cars." Grumbling under her breath, Agatha went out and into a small car hire office next door to the hotel. Yes, she was told, she could hire a car and pay with a British bank cheque if she wanted. "We drive on the British side of the road," said the car hire man in perfect English. Agatha signed the forms, paid for the car hire, and soon she was behind the wheel of a Renault and edging through the crowded streets of Kyrenia. The other drivers were slow but erratic. No one seemed to bother signaling to the right or the left. She pulled into a parking place on the main street, remembering she had a guide to North Cyprus in her handbag, which she had bought in Dillon's bookshop in Oxford before she left. It would surely have a list of hotels. The guidebook, Northern Cyprus by John and Margaret Goulding, she noticed for the first time, was actually published by the Windrush Press, Morton and Marsh in the Cotswolds. That seemed to her like a lucky sign. Sure enough, the hotels in Kyrenia were listed. She returned to her room at the Dome and called one after the other, but none had heard of James Lacey. She settled down in the air conditioning to read about Kyrenia instead. Although it was called Girne by the Turks, most still used its old name. In the same way, Nicosia had become Lefkosia, but was often so called Nicosia. Kyrenia, she read, is a small northern port and tourist center with a famously pretty harbor dominated by a castle. Founded as Kyrenia in the 12th century before Christ by Achaeans and renamed Corinium by the Romans. It was later walled against pirates and became a center for the carob trade, but fell largely into ruin in 1631, and by 1814 had become home to only a dozen families. It was revived under the British, who improved the harbour and built the road to Nicosia. Prior to the partition of the island after 1974, when the Turks landed to save their own people from being killed by the Greeks, Kyrenia was a popular retirement town for British expatriates. After 1974, it was settled by refugees from Limassol in the south of the island and once again resumed its role as a genteel resort with a new harbour to the east of the town. Agatha put down the guidebook. The mention of the new harbour had reminded her of the receptionist's suggestion of a sail. She went out again and walked dizzily in the blinding heat round to the harbour, wandering among the basket chairs of the fish restaurants until she saw a board advertising a cruise. It was a yacht called the Mary Jane. The skipper saw her studying the board and came along the gangplank and hailed her. He said the cruise cost £20 and included a buffet lunch. They sailed in half an hour and she would have time to go back to the hotel and fetch her swimsuit. Agatha bought a ticket and said she would be back. She is now too hot to even think of James. The idea of sailing in a sea breeze was too tempting. Let James wait. Somehow, perhaps because the heat was affecting her brain, she had imagined she would be the only passenger, but there were 8 others and all English. Another sip. There were 3 upper-class ones, sporting expensive clothes and laud-braying voices, 2 men and a woman. One man was elderly, with a yellowish-white moustache, glasses, and a pink scarf where the sun had scorched his bald spot. The other man was tall and thin and sallow, and appeared to be married to the woman, who was also tall and thin and sallow, but with a deep bosom and a hard air of sexiness about her. They belonged to that stratum which has adopted the very worst manners of the aristocracy, and none of the better ones. They shouted at each other rather than spoke, and they stared at the other passengers with a sort of "my God" look in their eyes. Their contemptuous gaze focused in particular on a woman named Rose, middle-aged, blonde-haired, with black roots, diamond rings on her long tapering fingers, who was also accompanied by two men, one quite elderly and the other middle-aged. The three were in a way a sort of mirror image of the upper-class ones, Rose having a sexy appeal, the middle-aged man appearing to be her husband, and the elderly one a friend. Agatha wished she had brought a book or newspaper to barricade herself behind. The skipper made the introductions. The upper-class ones were Olivia Debenham and her husband George and their friend Harry Templeton. The lower class were the aforementioned Rose, surname Wilcox, her husband Trevor, and their friend Angus King. Trevor had a beer belly and a truculent look, cropped fair hair and thick lips. Angus was an old Scotsman with sagging breasts revealed by his open-necked shirt. Like Rose and Trevor, he appeared to be pretty rich. In fact, thought Agatha, they probably belonged to the new rich class of Essex man and woman, risen to prosperity during the Thatcher years, and they could probably buy and sell the upper-class ones who were gazing at them with such contempt. Then there was a dreary couple who said in whispers that they were Alice and Bert Turpham Johns. Sorry, I don't know how to read that properly. Alice and Bert Turpham Johns, and Olivia sniggered and said in a loud aside that having a double-barreled name these days was no longer what it had been. Oh wow, is it me, or did it just sound like a bit of snob? Agatha would have been accepted by Olivia, George and Harry, who were monopolizing the small bar, but she had taken a dislike to them and so allied herself with the less distinguished, who were sitting in the bow. Rose had a silly laugh and a glottal stop speech of what has come to be known as estuary English, but Agatha began to become interested in her. Despite the fact that Rose was probably somewhere in her 50s, she had cultivated a somewhat baby doll appearance. She pouted. Her eyelashes, though false, were good. Her breasts, revealed by a low frilly sundress, were excellent, and her long, thin legs, ending in high-heeled strapped sandals, were brown and smooth. She had wrinkles on her neck and round her mouth and eyes, but every movement, every bit of body language seemed to scream out the promise of good in bed. Trevor was besotted with her, and so was the elderly Scotsman, Angus. In conversation, it came out that Trevor owned a prosperous plumbing business and that Angus, a recently made friend, was a retired shopkeeper. The quiet couple had taken out books and had started to read, and so the conversation went on among Agatha, Rose, Trevor, and Angus. Rose let slip, almost as if by accident, that she was very well read. After every occasional comment, it seemed to Agatha as if she remembered her role of silly, endearing woman and quickly returned to it. Had she settled for money? The diamonds on the many rings on her fingers were real. The voyage was short but pleasant, the sea breeze refreshing. They anchored in Turtle Beach Cove. They swam from the boat. Agatha was a good swimmer, but she was out of condition and found that the shore was much farther away than it had looked from the yacht. Relieved to have escaped from the others, She floated on her back in the shallow water and dreamed of meeting James, her eyes closed against the burning sun above. And then she floated against a rock. It was a flat rock, and it was a nudge she felt rather than a bump, but she struggled to her feet, suddenly terrified, and looked over wildly around. Oh. She had not yet got over the fright of being knocked unconscious by someone and nearly buried alive during what she considers as my last case. She could hear her heart thumping. She took several deep breaths and sat down in the green-blue water, which was shallow enough. The skipper, whose name was Abraham, was swimming about, making sure none of his passengers drowned or had a heart attack. His wife, who sailed with him, a short, black-haired woman called Ferda, was preparing lunch, and the clatter of dishes and glasses floated to Agatha's ears across the water. Rose's husband, Trevor, was having his great bog, sunburned now to a nasty salmon pink, up the ladder at the side of the yacht. He stopped halfway and turned and glared back across the bay. Agatha looked to see what had caught his attention. Sitting side by side in the water a little away from Agatha were Rose and Olivia's husband, George, giggling about something. Olivia herself was swimming backwards and forwards with powerful back arm strokes. Trevor was still halfway up the ladder. The elderly friends of the two women, Harry and Angus, were trying to get back on board the yacht. Harry reached up and tapped Trevor on the back. Trevor turned round and fell back into the water, nearly colliding with the two old men. He began to swim towards his wife. Rose saw him coming and immediately left George and began to swim towards him. Agatha stayed where she was, enjoying the solitude. She suddenly wished with all her heart that she could forget about James and be free again. Free to enjoy a peaceful holiday without being haunted and obsessed by the man. Then she heard herself being hailed from the yacht. Lunch was about to be served. Agatha was reluctant to return. Her brief interest in Rose had fled, leaving her with a feeling of distaste for all her fellow passengers. She swam back and pulled herself up the ladder, conscious of her own stomach. She would need to get herself in shape for James. Lunch was pleasant. Complimentary glasses of wine, good chicken, crispy salad. Pleased as any tourist might be to find she had not been ripped off, Agatha mellowed enough to join Rose, her husband and friend. She noticed, however, that Olivia's husband, George, kept looking over at Rose from his place at the bar. He said something to his wife in an undertone, and she answered loudly, "I don't feel like slumming today." When the young meet up on an outing abroad, they exchange addresses at the end of it and arrange to meet in the evening. The middle-aged and elderly, by silent consent, simply part with a nod and a smile. Agatha had enjoyed herself on the sail back, for she had told them all about her detective work and entertained them with highly embroidered stories about how clever she had been. But she too, after the yacht had slid into Kyrenia harbour under the shadow of the old castle, simply said goodbye and walked away. Olivia, her husband and friend were all residing at the Dome Hotel. With luck, she would be able to avoid them. She had more important work to do. She had to find James. Well, it's getting interesting, I guess. She was reluctant to dine in the hotel that evening, so she checked So she checked her guidebook and selected a restaurant called the Grapevine, which looked hopeful, and took a taxi the short distance there, not wanting to bother driving. It was a good choice, the restaurant being in the garden of an old Ottoman house. Agatha ordered wine and swordfish kebab and tried not to feel lonely. The garden was heavy with the scent of jasmine and full of the sound of British voices. It was a great favorite with the British residents, a blonde woman called Carol who served her meal told her. There were evidently a great number of British residents in North Cyprus. They even had their own village outside Kyrenia called Karaman, complete with houses called things like Cobblers, and a British library, and a pub called the Crow's Nest. Agatha had brought a paperback with her and was trying to read by candlelight when Carol brought her note. It said simply, "Come and join us." She looked across the restaurant. Just taking their seats at a center table were Rose, husband and friend, and Olivia, husband and friend. They were smiling and waving in her direction. Intrigued that such an unlikely combination should get together, Agatha picked up her plate and wine and went to join them. "Isn't this a surprise?" said Rose. "There we was, just walking down the street, when my Trevor, he says to me, 'Isn't that Olivia?' Agatha noticed Olivia wince. And Georgie says, 'Come and join us.' So here we all are. Ain't it fun?" To Agatha's amazement, Olivia seemed to be making an effort to be polite to Rose, Trevor, and Angus. It transpired that her husband George had recently retired from the Foreign Office. Friend Harry Trimbleton was a farmer, and that Olivia herself had heard of Agatha, for the Debenhams had a manor house in Lower Camber in the Cotswolds. The wine circulated, and Rose grew more animated. It seemed she was a specialist in the double entendre. She had a really filthy laugh, barroom laugh, a gin and 60 cigarettes a day laugh, which sounded around the restaurant. George crossed his legs under the table, and his foot brushed against Rose's legs. His foot brushed against Rose's legs. He apologized, and Rose shrieked with laughter. "Go on," she said, giving him a nudge with one thin pointed elbow. "I know what you're after." Agatha did not think anyone could eat kebab off its skewer in a suggestive manner, but Rose did. Then she, it seemed deliberately, misunderstood the simplest remarks. George said he hoped there wouldn't be another tube strike in London when they got back, because he had some business in the city to attend to. "A boob strike?" cried Rose gleefully. "Has Olivia stopped your jollies?" Agatha gave her a bored look, and Rose mouthed at her, like Lysistrata. So vulgar Rose knew her Greek classics, thought Agatha, who had only recently boned up on them herself. And somehow Rose knew that Agatha had rumbled her act. What was an intelligent woman doing being tied to the brutish Trevor and a dreary retired shopkeeper like Angus? Angus was a man of few words, and those that he had were delivered in a slow, portentous manner. "Scottish education is the finest in the world, yes," he said apropos of nothing, things like that. Olivia had a bright smile pinned on her face, and she tried to draw everyone out, and did it very well, thought Agatha, although noticing that Olivia could not quite mask that she detested Rose and thought Trevor a bore. She entertained them with a funny story about how the man in the hotel room upstairs had let his bath overrun so that it had seeped down into the ceiling of the room, and he refused to admit he was guilty and said they must have let the windows open and let the rain in. That's actually funny, I think. To Agatha's surprise, they all decided to go on an expedition to the Othello Tower in Famagusta the next day, and she was urged to join them. They would hire cars. She refused. Tomorrow was James Lacey hunting day. They had been going to spend their honeymoon at the rented villa outside Kyrenia. She would try to find it. Trevor, instead of paying the bill, joking that it would be the first time in his life he was a millionaire as he pulled out wads and wads of Turkish lira. Agatha refused a lift, deciding to walk back to the hotel. She was streetwise enough to know that she was safe, and Rose, who had arrived a week before her, had told her with a tinge of regret in her voice that there was no danger of getting your bottom pinched. Rose had also said that there was also no danger of getting your handbag snatched or of being cheated by shopkeepers. So Agatha strolled down past the town hall and down Kyrenia's main street. And then she saw James. He was ahead of her, walking with that achingly familiar long, easy, loping stride of his. She let out a strangled cry and began to run on her high heels. He turned a corner next to a supermarket. She ran ahead, calling his name, but when she too turned the corner, he had disappeared. She had once seen the French film Les Enfants du Paradis, and this felt like the last scene, where the hero desperately tries to catch up with his beloved. Sorry, my lenses are getting dry. Too much screen time, I guess. A Turkish soldier blocked her way and asked her anxiously in broken English if he could help her. "My friend, I saw my friend," babbled Agatha, staring up the side street. "Is there a hotel along there?" "No, that is Little Turkey. Ironmongers, cafes, no hotel. Sorry." But Agatha ploughed on, peering at deserted shops, stumbling over potholes. Then she saw a light shining out from a laundry called White Rose, Beyaz Gül in Turkish. A man in shirt sleeves was working at a dry cleaning machine. Agatha pushed open the door and went in. "Can I help you?" he asked. He was a small man with a clever, attractive face. "You speak English?" "Yes, I worked in England for some time as a nurse. My wife, Jackie, is English." "Oh, good. Look, I saw this friend of mine come along here a moment ago, but he's disappeared." "I don't know where he could have been going. Sit down. I'm called Bilal." "I'm Agatha." "Would you like a coffee? I'm working late because it's cooler at night. Trying to get as much done as I can when I can." Agatha felt suddenly tired, weepy and disappointed. "No, think I'll go back to the hotel." "North Cyprus is very small," he said sympathetically. "You're bound to run into your friend sooner or later. Do you know the Grave Pine?" "Yes, I had dinner there this evening." "You should ask there. All the British end up there sooner or later." For some reason, Bilal, although probably somewhere in his mid-40s, reminded her of Bill Wong. "Thanks," she said, getting off to her feet again. "Tell me the name of your friend," said Bilal, "and maybe I can find something out for you." "James Lacey, retired colonel, 50s, tall with very blue eyes and black hair going grey." "Are you at the Dome?" "Yes." "Write down your name for me. I have a terrible memory." Agatha wrote down her name. A laundry is an odd business for a nurse, she commented. I'm used to it now, said Bilal. At first, I made some awful mistakes. They would give me those Turkish wedding dresses covered in sequins, and I'd put them in a dry cleaning machine, but the sequins were made of plastic and they all melted. And then they come down from the mountains with their suit they bought about 40 years ago, covered in olive oil and wine, and expect me to give it back to them looking like new. He gave a comical sigh. In any case, can I come back and see you? Asked Agatha. Anytime. We can have coffee. Feeling somewhat cheered, she left. She wandered round more streets. Men sat outside cafes playing backgammon, music blared, half-key Turkish music, sad and haunting. At last she gave up the search and returned to the hotel. She thought she should have gone back to the grave pine, maybe tomorrow. So this is where I'm going to finish for now. We can continue in the next video if you would like. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm waiting to see you soon. Bye bye.